The author writes that Dickie Mountbatten was born on June 25th, 1900, at Frogmore House. And he was a great-grandson and godson of Queen Victoria. His mother, Victoria, born in 1863, was the daughter of the Queen's second daughter, Alice. Dickie's mother was to be an important influence, encouraging in her youngest child supreme self-confidence and acting as his tutor between the ages of 5 and 10. She taught me English, German, French, and Latin. She taught me world history in a horizontal manner, he later recalled. In the Elizabethan era, I knew what was going on in Europe and India, as well as in England. And truly, the family was so well connected across Europe that it wouldn't have been difficult to understand the history going on because you also knew many of the major players, so it would have been of greater interest to you had you been in his position. Now, he was christened Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas, but he was always known as Dickie, sometimes spelled with a Y, sometimes spelled with an I-E. His father, Prince Louis, born in 1854 in Austria, was the son of Prince Alexander and Princess Julie of Hesse, the oldest ruling Protestant dynasty in the world, but as it was a morganatic marriage, the children were excluded from the succession to the sovereignty of Hesse. This genealogical flaw in Mountbatten's ascendance was to be an embarrassment, which he would seek to brush over in later life. Dickie's father had joined the Royal Navy, aged 14, and enjoyed a successful naval career, becoming Director of Naval Intelligence shortly after his younger son's birth. Part of the slightly louche said around Edward VII, his torso boasted a tattoo of a dragon. In 1881, he had fathered a child, Jean Marie, with the king's mistress, Lily Langtry. So Dickie's dad was pretty wild in his own right, you know. That is bold to go ahead and have a child out of wedlock, not with anybody, but with the king's own mistress. Whoa, man. Zip those pants up. Find something else to do. In 1884, Prince Louis had married his cousin Victoria, eldest daughter of the Grand Duke Louis of Hesse, and a favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and their children, Alice, Louis, and George, were born respectively in 1885, 1889, and 1892. Fluent in French and German, a skilled pianist and artist who had been elected to the Royal Institute of Painters and Watercolors, he was worshipped by his youngest child. As the youngest, and with a gap of between 15 and 8 years with his siblings, Dickie was used to amusing himself and getting his own way. He later recollected, "I was spoilt, and no one minded." I think people probably did mind. It seemed too much of a trouble to fix the issue, so better just let you continue to have your way. His was an essentially female household, as his brother and father were seldom at home, where he was doted on by his mother, 2 elder sisters, and various female members of staff. This was to have a powerful effect on him later in life. He was always to get on with women better than men, who were either to be admired, like his father and brother, or seen as antagonists to be defeated. It was also a much more cosmopolitan upbringing than that enjoyed by most British children of the time. Just after his first birthday, he had stayed with the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, the governor of Moscow, before going on to the Peterhof Palace. And for Christmas, when he was 5 years old, he received from the Tsar, who was married to Dickie's aunt, a replica uniform of the Crack Chevalier Guard, complete with helmet, breastplate, boots, spurs, and sword. No telling what that cost to have made for a 5-year-old. It was to be the start of a lifelong love of uniforms for Dickie. Now, I was astounded because recently I had just been reading about the assassination of Rasputin, and little did I know that Dickie Mountbatten was related to those involved in the assassination. The book goes on to say that Dickie spent the summer of 1908 with various Russian relations, where, at the Nicholas Palace in St. Petersburg, he became friendly with his cousin, the Grand Duke Dmitri, one of the 2 conspirators behind the death of Rasputin. Is there anyone that Dickie doesn't know or isn't related to? This was followed by a week with Tsar Nicholas and his family at the Petrov Palace. Now, the time had come for him to enter his real studies. No more living under the tutor of mother, boarding school. And his parents picked Lockers Park, a fashionable prep school just north of London, with strong naval connections, which Dickie's cousin Maurice and brother George had attended a few years previously. Now, of course, you can't enter into a boarding school and remain unmaimed, so he begins being attacked immediately. They like to make fun of his name. He wrote to his mother and said, "Some of my nicknames are Batter Pudding, 2 things beginning with P, Prince, and Pig, also London Fire Brigade like LFB. One boy spelt my name Battenberg. Okay, you'll help me figure this out, because I don't understand this. Was his name always Mountbatten, or was it Battenberg before? Is the joke that his friend is playing on him, was he Germanizing Mountbatten by saying Battenberg? You know, Berg being mountain in German. I mean, or was their name Battenberg and then they changed it to Mountbatten to sort of anglify the last name when there was so much aggression towards Germans? I'm not sure. He doesn't say it, but then was it just a joke? Because the way the boy spelled his name was Batumberg. Was the joke that he turned Mountbatten into a German, like the German form of it? Or was the joke that he just didn't spell his last name correctly? I don't know. Regardless, how did he do at school? What was his deal in school? Well, it would seem that he faced school the way a person would face a marathon. He kind of slogged through it at first, slow, sort of at the bottom of his class. But then at the end of every term, he'd be like number one in the class. And this happened repeatedly. It was almost like a pattern with him. He was a friendly student, kind, and he was popular. One contemporary, Sir Hamilton Kerr, later remembered how when he was lonely and miserable at the school, he discovered that Mountbatten could speak German. We talked German on Sunday afternoons, walking up and down the school lawn. One never forgets these kindnesses of early youth, says Sir Hamilton in remembrance. Now, was he athletic? No. Not naturally. But he did manage to reach the finals of the boxing competition and captain the second football team. Above all, his qualities of leadership were beginning to be recognized, and he became a prefect. His headmaster wrote of him that he always acted on the principle that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing well. The headmaster went on to say that we all regret that his stay at the school has come to an end, and I am confident of his future success. Because, of course, it's time to move on to college, and his parents chose for him to go to Osborne, the Navy's training school on the Isle of Wight, passing in 15th out of the 83 cadets. Now, if he thought he'd been ill-used at Locker's Park even slightly, Osborne was very different. The 430 boys, many from naval families, were subject to naval discipline. And instead of school uniforms, they wore naval dress, ranging from monkey jackets to dress uniforms for special occasions. The curriculum was focused on subjects such as engineering, navigation, and seamanship, and it was a tough environment aimed at developing self-discipline, initiative, and confidence. There was a lot of bullying, and Dickie, cocky and feminine-looking, was frequently bullied. In May, he got into a fight with a boy who had been at Locker's Park, John Scott, who teased him about his name. And because he was willing to stand up to John Scott, he earned the respect of his peers when he fought back. Academically, he was still doing well. His tutor wrote that he made an excellent start. He said he invariably shows great keenness in everything and is always out to learn. And by the next term, his teacher had written that he possesses the gift of thoroughly mastering a subject before he allows himself to pass on. This was to prove a characteristic throughout his life. So determined is what he is. Now, what of his free time? The summer of 1913 was spent in Hesse with his older siblings. Of course, it's lovely that he was born in 1900 because it's easy to keep track of his age. He's 13 at the time. The summer of 1913 was spent in Hesse with his older siblings. Alice, who was now married to Prince Andrew of Greece, Louis and George. George was now a lieutenant on the battlecruiser HMS New Zealand. They were joined in Hesse by the Tsar and Tsarina and their 5 children. The Tsar and Tsarina and their 5 children. One of whom was this 14-year-old Marie, who Dickie fell madly in love with. He said, I was crackers about Marie. And he said she was absolutely lovely. I keep her photograph on the mantelpiece in my bedroom. I always have. Unfortunately, within 5 years, all the family would be dead at the hand of the Bolsheviks. Isn't that crazy? That you would vacation with these people and then 5 years later they're all slaughtered? Dickie would have been 18, so you can imagine his dismay that Marie, who he had had such fondness for, would be dead. Of course, he'd be dismayed about any of it, but, particularly since he had such a thing for her. Now, the following year, after he goes on vacation in Hesse with the Tsar and Tsarina and all their kids, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and of course, the war is on. Prince Louis, his father, had become First Sea Lord in 1912, and Dickie was invited to watch a full test mobilization of the fleet on July 18th. Dickie was thrilled to watch the Royal Review at Spithead in front of King George V with the full might of the Royal Navy laid out in front, some 59 battleships, 55 cruisers, 78 destroyers, 16 submarines, and a host of lesser craft, and to meet Admiral Jellicoe and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Dickie had met Churchill before. He didn't think much of him because Churchill had come to Osborne, and he asked the cadets if they had any requests. Dickie was the first one to speak up, and he said, yes, sir. Would it be possible for us to have 3 sardines on Saturday night's dinner instead of just the 2 sardines that were given? And Winston Churchill said he'd see about it, but the sardines were not forthcoming. It was a lesson that Dickie would remember, and he didn't care for that. What about that 3rd sardine, man? It was Prince Louis alone on duty on the fateful Friday before the outbreak of war who had to make the decision not to stand down the fleet, but keep them mobilized. It proved to be a wise decision. The following day, Germany and Russia declared war on each other, and on August 4th, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Now, his father should have continued to go on to have an illustrious career. He's a very talented man, and he had risen to the ranks, and he had worked hard. And he was First Sea Lord. But when a country decides to declare war on another country, and in this case, England declaring war on Germany, a very nasty thing can happen in that suddenly there's all this anti-German feeling. And it seems very hard for people to differentiate that there are actions of war that you can find deplorable, but the people themselves of that country aren't at fault for the actions of their leaders. And so, I mean, as recently as the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine, when that broke out, there was this odd strain of hatred toward anything Russian, even now, even in this day and age, when you would think that we would be able to differentiate the nuance between a government making a poor choice and the people and the culture and the customs. And then, there was all of this cancellation of anything Russian. It was very disgusting and sickening. But of course, the same thing was seen, and to a much higher degree at this time when England had decided to declare war against Germany. Well, with Prince Louis's background, having been born in Austria, and because he spoke German and because of his relations and all of this, it became a major distraction to the efforts that he was trying to put forth. The author goes on to describe this. He says, there was an almost instant wave of anti-German feeling with assaults on suspected Germans. Even dachshunds were targeted. How are you going to go after somebody's German dog? And the looting of stores owned by people with German-sounding names. Mountbatten initially joked to his mother on August 14th that Papa has turned out to be a genuine spy and has been discreetly marched off to the tower where he's guarded by beefeaters. I got rather a rotten time of it for about 3 days as little fools like Stopsford insisted on calling me German spy and kept on heckling me and trying to make things unpleasant for me. In October, the German-accented Prince Louis, feeling that the criticisms of him as head of the Navy were a distraction from the war effort, resigned as First Sea Lord. He had faithfully served his adopted country for 46 years, and yet Winston Churchill made no attempt to dissuade him. His son was devastated. Another cadet saw a contemporary standing in front of the Osborne mast with tears running down his cheeks. It was Dickie. From that day, he was to have one consuming ambition, to avenge his father's dismissal and become First Sea Lord himself. Poor guy, what a devastation, because it's his whole life has been sort of in the shadow of his dad, but he didn't mind standing there in the shadow of his dad. And I've seen, 46 years in service to the Navy, and because he had a German accent, it was becoming so distracting that he resigned his post. What a unearned humiliation. I don't blame Dickie for being I will avenge, And of course, as a young, ambitious person, as much as I'm sure he resented the fact that this has happened to his dad, it gives him a very clear mission and goal in life, So I'm sure there was a part of him that hated it and a part of him that loved having so clear a path to follow.